Bonjour. Phil, I know you're very intelligent, but that's French, if you were wondering.
Thanks.
No worries, no worries.
My French isn't great. I got an E at GCSE Spanish, so
an E?
I need all the, yeah.
I didn't even know it went to E. I thought it went F, then U, as unmarkable. Maybe you were part of the generation that they just thought, you know what, fuck this, let's get rid of the E's. This is just, yeah, wow. Yeah,
I did get an E.
I think
it's
in
one
my
of those
examination
things where
period, it was D then U, actually.
Really? I would get the lack of effort I put into languages because I've just seen how important languages are in terms of how you learn.
I think it is
get involved
village
with
in the UK that most of us can only speak English. And you go to German, they're like, oh, do you speak English? Like, oh, yeah, a little bit, yes, but I've only been practicing for 17 years, so I don't want to embarrass myself. But, you know, when you think about the proclivity of the cultural influence of it, like, you speak better English than I do, mate, please.
It's awful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really bad.
No, that's brilliant. The English not speaking many languages is awful.
Yeah. Agreed.
We're going to get a listener who can speak like 17 languages who's English, and it's like, what? Hold on.
Well, have you met my friend Andrew Jackson? He did Loch Ness Marathon with us. Has he been to Ardmay? No, he is a polyglot by definition. I think he can speak 7 languages. I think he then tried to learn Japanese, but it was the writing that he was like, nah, this is a different league for me.
I'm jealous.
Yeah,
I wish
so am
I had
I.
that skill.
But like, I'm ashamed. It's like it's a point of shame for me. Like, it's bad. I think it's really ignorant of us as Brits. No, it's English. Everyone speaks it, isn't it? Yeah. Café con leche, please. Dos cervezas, por favor. Aye. All right. Anyway, what are we talking about? We're talking about energy systems. In Spanish. No, I'm kidding. We're definitely not. We're talking about it in English.
Not with an E.
No. But we'll put a little accent on energy systems. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down at a real top-line level what you need to know about energy systems when it comes to hypertraining, concurrent training, balancing, endurance, and strength. Because hypertraining as a term has evolved, as a culture has evolved, and that's fantastic. More and more people are trying more and more things. But I think it's very important to understand the nuance of why the term was created in the first place, which was to balance opposing ends of that energy system spectrum. Because the further apart energy systems become in terms of adaptation, the more at odds they are with one another in terms of training allocation, adaptive energy, and making progress in both concurrently. That was the sort of problem that Alex Viada was aiming to solve when he wrote the book in 2015, titled The Hybrid Athlete, The Origin of the Term. And I think for how much the term is being used these days, I think it's an important reminder that is sort of its origins. And the problem it was aiming to address was this energy system spectrum, where the further out from the middle you go in terms of opposing ends, the more challenging it becomes to program for and make progress in those systems concurrently. So, Phil, from your perspective, what do people need to know about energy systems in terms of hypertraining? Which is the least direct question I could have asked you. So it's like I've wound up the toy and just let loose. Broad question, of course. We will be more specific, but I think if you could summarize that sort of spectrum, what do people need to know in the first instance?
Okay, I'm just thinking of the direction to take this. I think the first point to make is that whatever different type of endurance training that you do, so whether it be kind of sprints or anything that's very short, like under 10 seconds, all the way up to marathon, ultra marathon, all require oxygen to generate energy. So for example, if I did a 6-second sprint on a watt bike and I had a NIRS device, which is looking at the O2 levels in the blood, within the muscle, you'll start to see that you get a desaturation. So clearly oxygen is starting to be used for energy. In this case, the demand and usage of oxygen is less than what's coming in through you breathing, so it starts to drop down. And that tends to be what happens during any immediate sudden of exercise. And that's why they start to bring in the phosphocreatine system, because it generates ATP very quickly, or regenerates ATP very quickly, and can get that to generate energy for the whatever that they're doing, sprinting, lifting, whatever it might be.
So in real simple terms, like top end output, maximal output is CP system.
Yeah. But at the same time, you've still got oxidative pathways going, because otherwise oxygen wouldn't be used, in the CP system. Oxygen isn't involved, but oxygen is definitely being used for energy. So it isn't just like, oh, you're sprinting, it's this energy system. Oh, now you've sprinted a little bit longer, that one stops and you move on to this one. There's all this crossing over. But the longer that you do, or longer that you work, let's say, in endurance training, then you're going to start to see the inclusion of other different energy systems. So I guess you've got glycolysis. So you move into more like aerobic, anaerobic glycolysis. And from there, what happens is that you get the breakdown of, ultimately, during energy production, you get the increase in lactate. And you're quite familiar with lactate profiles. And initially, they're quite low as you start to increase the velocity or the power that you're working at. And then you start to see it rise until it exponentially rises. So we essentially have this initial portion where lactate production and lactate clearance is pretty much equal. So that's why it doesn't really move too much. Okay. And people might be familiar with this as like more zone 2, zone 1, whatever it might be, but it's before the original lactate threshold. Or lactate threshold 1. I'm going to keep it quite simple because there's so many different names for each term point.
I was going to say, I think explaining all this and then referring to it from here on out as sort of LT1 and LT2, I actually think is a tidier way to make this point within a zone system personally. So, yeah, Omnia Performance Podcast decree, LT1, LT2 is how this conversation is going. So please work within those parameters, Phil.
Sure. And then you'll get to a point where, let's say you cross LT1, but the reason that you're doing it is because the amount of lactate that's been developed is greater than what's either been removed or what's been used, because lactate's a great additional fuel source. So you get to a point it starts to rise, you start to see this slight increase. So you get to this phase where speed is increased, and that means lactate production has increased, but you have the ability to clear it. You get into a steady state. So that's the difference between above lactate threshold 2 and under lactate threshold 2. Lactate increases, but you have the ability to clear it. Increase the speed a little bit more, you get this spike, but then it starts to settle because you can get into a steady state. The reason that you go past lactate threshold 2 is that you increase the intensity of your training, but the body has no ability to go into a steady state. So if you stay at that intensity or even increase it, but mainly if you stay at the intensity, lactate production is just going to go up and up and up and up and up. So that's when you get into lactate threshold 2. So or beyond lactate threshold 2. So there's kind of different zones, and there's a load of different models for this.
For context, anyone that's ever done any of our LTHR testing as part of their programming, that is essentially testing that point where you cannot enter a steady state, or the max point at which you can sustain before you cross that threshold. From there, you can then establish training zones. But I think one of the easiest ways to frame how you actually train within that context is viewing it as a ballpark, because I think there's a lot of emphasis on zones. We place a lot of emphasis on zones, but at the end of the day, your body doesn't know exactly what your watch is feeding back to you. It knows what stimulus it is receiving and what processing is going on internally. And that's where LT1, LT2 and above is kind of a nice way to know if you're working in this rate, because there's a talk of the grey zone. Spending too much time in zone 3 is, it's dead training, it's achieving nothing. When in reality, it's not achieving nothing. It might not be hyper specific, and it might be a little bit harder than super easy, but it's not achieving nothing. But I think the context is, for anyone that wants to frame their sort of pacing zones in any endurance setting, viewing it as sort of easy, medium, and hard, LT1, LT2, above, is a nice way of doing it.
There's some models see the bit just above lactate threshold 1, where you are getting to a point where the lactate can still get into a steady state, is more tempo running.
Yep.
And then the further you get to around that point of lactate threshold 2, that is seen as threshold running. So yeah, essentially that point is like the point where it just becomes unsustainable. And there's a number of different ways of or methods that have looked at that, because either you could be lactate threshold or lactate turn point, because you're using lactate to determine where that point is, or it could be more performance based. So, functional threshold power, as an example, or maximal lactate steady state. They are theoretical points where they believe a threshold passes where you can get into a steady state, and beyond that, you actually can't get into a steady state. So training around there is quite a nice point, because you're trying to shift that point to the right if you look at it from a graph perspective. And I had a mate of mine a while back said that Kipchoge managed to run, I can't remember if it's a London Marathon or if it's his record, he managed to run the whole of that marathon staying at 97% of critical velocity. So if you think of that, where that threshold is, he was by it for 2 hours. I mean, wow. That's impressive, because it's really high. You know, it's at like 21k per.
So what's super fascinating there is essentially he has reached the sort of crest of theoretical and practical human output, which he's done, ticked. He's got to that point. Then there's probably been 10 years of training to be able to hold it for that percentage. Because I'm sure maybe, I don't know the data. It'd be interesting to know if your mate did, on marathon runners that came second, third, fourth after him, what percentage of their race was done at critical velocity versus that 97%, and how many years of training is the difference between 93% versus 97 in that setting, for example. Because you're pushing, it's not like do more and more and you'll get faster and faster. There is a certain limit at which a human being can actually turn its legs over that distance, and I don't know how much further it'll go in 50, 60, 70 years. Sneaky exoskeletons making their way into people internally, I don't know.
Bouncing along to records.
Yeah, we'll see. But I think that is fascinating. 97%. Wow.
Yeah, but also because if you creep over that threshold, you're getting to a point where
you're gone.
Well, it's unsustainable. So you've only got a limited battery how you can maintain that speed. But then having the knowledge to maintain that, or you have to drop it down, and that's where people have problems, is because they then overstep their threshold without knowing, or there might be a number of reasons why drift has happened, and then suddenly find themselves over that threshold, and then they've got a limited battery of how they can maintain that particular speed. So there's a lot of different things at play there, including qualities like running economy and durability, which is a new concept that's come in the last few years. It's about people can maintain a certain, have a really good half marathon time, but terrible marathon time, because they just don't have the durability to be able to last that distance.
So we've covered superficially, I admit, just a reminder, there's a link in the description down below for a less superficial overview from our research download from our end, which you can read through at your leisure. Swedish now. I've thrown myself off what I was going to say there. Yes, we've spoken about endurance training in terms of energy systems, but what are we trying to balance this against in this context? Strength training. And the pathways at play for adaptation there operate differently. There are some similarities in terms of maximal output lifting is obviously operating on a CP system in some ways. And a misconception as well is that if you're out of breath after a set of 8, then you must have been operating aerobically, when in fact it's not actually the same mechanism at play that's eliciting that out of breath response, so to speak, and you're not stimulating yourself aerobically through that set of 8. Sorry to all powerlifters listening, if it is over a set of 5, it is not, in fact, cardio. Whilst it does feel like it, cardio is cardio, and sets of 8 are just hard work, I'm afraid to say. Take that as someone that very much previously used to avoid anything over a set of 5 as a powerlifter for about 4 years. So I know what it's like. So mTOR, MPK, the things that are spoken about most frequently within the context of the interference effect and what we are trying to prevent being interfered with. What do people need to know?
There's a lot of different components there. One's molecular, neuromuscular, sort of like energy systems. In terms of the differences, I'll try and keep to sort of phosphocreatine and that type of thing. No, let's look at it from a muscular level. Let's take that power lifter that is doing a set of 8 or 5 or so like that, and they're breathless. Right, you've got to think about what's happening there. One, they're probably holding their breath to stiffen up to be able to perform the lift. So
bracing.
All of a sudden, you're restricting respiration. On top of that, every time they make a contraction, it almost like acts as a tourniquet to the muscle. So that's stopping deoxygenated blood to get back to the lungs to get reoxygenated. And that's why you quite often see in very heavy sets, is because obviously you need more tension, it acts more like that. Muscle saturation really, really drops in real heavy sets. So the body is clearly craving oxygen, but the method, because of high tension and the tourniquet action that's happening there, the muscle oxygenation is starting to get restricted. And usually their ability to contract, relax isn't as great because they don't often need to do that, because they just need high tension because that is their sport, because they're a powerlifter and they need as much tension as possible to lift that. This is very different from an endurance athlete who may not have as much tension because they are technically weaker. But they have the ability to switch on, switch off, switch on, switch off. Think about it every time they make a step during running. So obviously their ability to relax is much better, so they get that return of deoxygenated blood so they can get reoxygenated. Hybrid athletes need to be able to do both. They need to be able to generate huge amounts of tension for their strength work, but also have that amazing ability to contract, relax for their endurance work. And that's hard to develop. One side you've got to push tension, the other side you've got to push relaxation. And that's difficult. And so that's why I think that's one of the reasons I think if you get someone that's a really, really strong powerlifter but can also run sub 3, let's see, sub 3 marathon, well, like yourself.
I didn't actually manage in the end. I didn't even get to the start. I think I was good.
You were around that area.
I was good for 252 on paper, but didn't even get to the start line in one piece. So I won't let you, to use a very Gen Z phrase, glaze my ability there, Phil. We've got a new hire who's 18 years old, so I'm picking up on some of the lingo. I didn't actually manage that. So just to clarify, I won't have any stolen valor here.
Well, I'm really old because I had no idea glaze actually existed in terms of language.
I didn't until last week, so I'm using my.
So using it as much as possible, get it in there.
Does that have I inadvertently just have I become the 18-year-old in this situation to you? Oh no, have I become? Interesting. Okay, I'll dwell on this. Maybe I'll stop using this lingo flippantly in conversation. Anyway, we were talking about an athlete's ability to have a strength at high output and the endurance output before we derailed things.
Yeah. And I think that's really important. On top of that, to help with moving large masses, you need to be heavier, because mass moves mass. Let's not go into the weeds in terms of physics.
Functional mass moves mass from a contractile point of view, isn't it? Which I think is where. That's a whole other conversation. That'd actually make for an interesting podcast topic, wouldn't it? Because there's discussion on leverage, there's discussion on actual functional mass, muscle utilization, and then how that translates neurologically, et cetera, et cetera. Well, pencil it in. Kelly, if you wouldn't mind writing that down for the future, that'd be great. Thank you. Mass moves mass, bro, question mark. That's the title of that podcast.
Also, being heavier means every time you take a step during endurance training, you're expending more energy because you're moving more mass. So there's so many things to balance in terms of trainable qualities, but also, physical qualities. So, it's not. I don't think it's as simple as be as light as possible, but as strong as possible. It's not as simple as that. And I've spoken to some athletes who are like, you know what, I quite like being bigger. I want to get as fit as possible, but at this size. So I always know I'm going to limit my peak endurance ability just because I want to be a little bit heavier. But I think, and this might be an unpopular opinion, but I think there's a lot of people in the hybrid training space that have gone the other way, where they've spent years and years lifting, they're in good shape, and they've almost entirely abandoned their strength training with intent other than to look
like someone who lifts and go in and sort of do a bit of a bro split, full evolution in some ways to prioritize the endurance outputs. And there's nothing wrong with that at all, just to be clear. Nothing wrong with that as the decision made. But I think it's then acknowledging that you are not trying to elicit a strength response. You are essentially abandoning that, but holding on to what was there previously just by virtue of it being there, which means that you're suddenly not then having to balance the difficulty of two opposing training disciplines. You've just allocated all of your adaptive energy and focus to the endurance output whilst having some lingering muscle mass and looking like someone that lifts, which works very well on social media, I must say. And there, again, to highlight, there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But this is just why I think it's important to highlight the energy system spectrum, because if you shift all of your allocation to one end and you aren't then balancing an opposing discipline, you fall out with the original categorization of what Alex intended with the definition of a hybrid athlete, so to speak. So either end of that spectrum, like you said, there's the strength end, and then there's the strength athlete that's doing a little bit of aerobic work to support their health and support their recovery between sets. That's probably a little bit too biased to one side versus training opposing ends of that spectrum.
Yeah, I guess there's the difference between an endurance athlete who does strength training to improve their endurance performance versus a hybrid athlete.
Yeah. Which again is nuanced.
And
I think whenever I go down this rabbit hole on the internet now, I always get sick of hearing myself talk about it. But I think it's an important nuance. I'm very protective. I feel I'm more protective over Alex's definition than he is, which is just his humility and probably being less online than I am. But curse my YouTube channel. It means that I feel like every time I hit upload, I'm on the internet and sucked into a hole for 20 minutes. But yeah, no, I love training this way. And I think having that context and that understanding is important so that for other people that love training this way, they're as well informed as possible onto the sort of context that we're playing in and why we're having this discussion, because essentially we are discussing how best to frame the problem of these are opposing energy systems. I want to improve in both. How do I get there?
That's the question. That's what we're still trying to figure out.
We're always figuring it out, and it will always change. But we believe that we are very good at figuring it out for an individual. So, OMNIA
you have a lot of
link in description down below.
You've got a lot of case studies which prove that. So
we do indeed, and have enjoyed the evolution of playing that game in terms of the problem solving. Because at the end of the day, that's all strength and conditioning is. It's problem solving, isn't it? It's you're looking at an individual's circumstances and the outputs that they require and the abilities that they currently have. How do we fill the gaps to get to the outcome that we're looking for? And in what amount, on what days, in what context do we do it? And then how do you adjust when things maybe aren't as they appeared on paper and go from there? It is as simple as that. And that's the fun of it. And I think, I don't know, in your opinion on this, how much of the fun of strength and conditioning has been lost in the modern world? I think it's either become completely binary or totally sensationalist. There's almost nothing in the middle anymore.
That's an interesting question, because I guess strength and conditioning principles can be utilized for any goal, really, any physical goal. So it covers such a wide area. And because of that, everyone has their little pockets and they want to, show their expertise in those particular areas. I definitely think it's become sensationalized. I think there's research coming out which is starting to look at changes in S&C practice since social media. So there might be around...
Joel Seedman mentioned.
Training for novelty. Because usually following an S&C program and being consistent over time isn't the most flash thing.
No, it's not. It's boring and consistent.
Yeah. And I think it's led to people probably competing more often than they should if they have higher aspirations of human performance. Or they could compete and, not fully go for it. But, people look up, don't they? What was your score in High Rocks, or what happened here? And people use that as a way of legitimizing what they say. And, so it goes on to that whole performative thing of strength and conditioning. So, but I think it's happening in every industry. I've even heard how when Netflix makes a movie, the first 5 minutes has to be as action-packed as possible because people will just switch off onto the next thing.
Split testing thumbnails, and I think they're I don't know if it's true, but I read the other day that they are, when designing movies or TV shows, they are assuming that someone is also on their phone in the background.
Yeah,
which makes me feel quite
terrified.
Ill. But it's the world that we live in. It is the world that we live in. But I think, again, look, not to get profound about it, but that's why I love training across disciplines, because it can often be de-digitized in a way that gives me so much value that's actually quite often difficult to find in the modern world. And I will admit, podcast exclusive, I did 2 training Ironmans over the weekend. And yesterday, as I got off the turbo trainer, 5.5 hours later, for the first time since 2019, I thought, fuck it, I need to dip my hand into the cookie jar. The cookie jar being, I'm going to need headphones for this run. Because mentally I was very, very switched off, and I just thought 3 hours of running after 5.5 hours of riding for the second day in a row is making me want to swing at someone or something. Reached into the cookie jar, i.e. my pocket, and I realised my headphones were at home. So having the option removed meant that I've stuck to my streak, but it's interesting to know that I did have to dip into that cookie jar because of the cumulative fatigue and therefore decision-making that went with it. But yeah, I think it's something I want to be honest about, because
I've always been impressed by you being able to do that, because I can't. I am a lesser man. I just cannot. I cannot bring myself to, like, if I've got an hour on the turbo trainer, I am literally like, right, what can I watch? What can I listen to?
But you spend, I think you'll spend a lot more time with text and print than I will, which I think is a good thing. Your reading chair behind and bookshelf behind you implies as such. I don't read as much as I used to, and that's probably systemic as to why I feel so cosmically connected to being disconnected whilst doing my training outdoors or indoors if I'm feeling psychopathic. I do wear headphones on the treadmill unless I feel like I want to prove something to myself, which often after about 20 minutes I think, wow, this would be much better with headphones, and this gym is not as exciting as I thought it was. But anyway, we digress. Netflix, split testing thumbnails, digitization, strength and conditioning in the modern world is problem solving. That's how we got here. That's how this all began. And I think that is what any program is designed to do, is you're looking at an individual's ability. Where are they strong? Where are they weak? What energy systems are they competent in? What energy systems are they not competent in? What energy systems are required for their goal? What are not? What are supportive and therefore need developed? What is not as supportive and therefore doesn't need developed? And then you allocate the resources that you have available to that. That is adaptive energy. That is time. That is mental focus. It can be finances as well, in terms of investing in certain things to be able to do certain things easier. And we all have finite resources. We all have variable levels of resources. And I would encourage people to understand what it is they're trying to achieve and why the training required to achieve it is the training required, because of the energy systems at play. Because the further apart on that spectrum you get, the more challenging it will be. Which leads me on to a question I'm going to put you on the spot with, Phil, and I know you love being put on the spot by me on these podcasts. I'm going to do it again. What do you think the 2 most challenging outcomes to train for and execute concurrently are in a sort of energy system setting? If you can give specific outcomes like an Ironman or a certain weight to them, that would be great. But what are the 2 things that you think are most opposed?
Weightlifting and ultra running.
Olympic weightlifting.
Yeah.
Okay, good shout.
Because heavy loads that require very fast contractions, and it's those muscle fibers which get fatigued the most. And if we look at some of the literature, it's very small, but you do get some fiber type conversion when you do large amounts of volume of amounts is volume of running. So it really doesn't support weightlifting performance. And because it's an ultra, you've got to do a lot of time on feet. You've got to build that durability. You've got to, develop time on feet because you're trying to, improve tolerance and capacity in your tissues just to keep going. There's a large time factor with that. It's the same with triathlon, but ultra, at least you get time in the pool, time on the bike, where it's not as reactive with every step. So those are the two I would say, because they are, if you think about slow plod bouncing along versus a very high rated force development for weightlifting, the muscle, the contractional ability to produce force for both of them is so different. And one's going to create a lot of fatigue, which then
with minimal eccentric loading
so,
as well, which means that you're kind of over-indexing on concentric loading massively. Like it's just, I would agree. Yeah. I would agree. Tough.
And stiffness is great for long distance running. Something that you try and quality you try and improve running economy. But then all of a sudden you do weightlifting where you've got to catch in a full range of motion quickly. Like the two are so separate. So I've written before how I think it would be cool to see someone do like a really cool, snatch, clean and jerk total and perform well at an ultra.
I've got in my iPhone notes somewhere 1,000 kilo super total and a sub 10 hour 100k. That is mutant level ability and is quite strength biased, but I'd like to see the probably Eastern European mutant that would be able to do that. Was it Levitnov? I don't believe Levitnov. Have you heard of this? The 400-pound squat into 400 meters in under 60 seconds over and over again. This guy called Levitnov used to do this regularly, apparently.
No, I've not heard of him.
Yeah, look it up afterwards. I'm suspicious of this potential old wives' tale, so to speak. But anyway, if Levitnov existed, he is the mutant that I'm referring to that could do a 1,000 kilo super total and a 100 kilometer run under 10 hours. I like the neatness of that, but yeah, no, I agree. Very tough. Anything you think? I know we've been very superficial today, and again, reminder for people down below, link for a research PDF that gives you a bit more detail on the things that we think are important for you to understand. Anything in terms of energy systems, theoretically, that we haven't mentioned, or any other key points of understanding that you want to reiterate for people?
Not to add, but I would argue that athletes and coaches should understand what happens with energy systems. Because it's still so thought of that when one switches on, the other one switches off. I'm sprinting, all of a sudden I'm just using one, and then all of a sudden I'm using the other, but really they overlap a lot.
Yeah,
and your ability to isn't just about. It really helps at the muscular level as well. Understanding muscle oxygen saturation, and how that works. So it isn't just necessarily how much you're bringing in through respiration. How is the muscle actually utilizing it? And I think there are really key scientific principles that everyone should know if you are a coach and if you're an athlete, definitely have a really high interest in it, because it's really quite key for a hybrid athlete.
Final question on that, more specific, for coaches and athletes. What are the external stressors? I'll flip this on its head. What energy systems are most impacted by external stressors? Things like sleep, arguments with superiors at work, travel, all that sort of thing. Is there any research to support when you should maybe pull back a little bit in terms of certain output requirements, depending on what end of the spectrum you're operating on, based on external stresses getting in the way? Or is that just a case of systemic fatigue versus the work required?
More so from like an overall fatigue point of view. If you're thinking about other stresses that can affect someone, that's just essentially going to mean that every step is going to have a greater oxygen cost. let's say, an energetic cost. So I wouldn't necessarily like, oh, if you did this, it's going to directly affect, from a stress point of view, it's going to directly affect that energy system. You could argue having poor muscle glycogen could affect your ability to draw upon glycogen for glycolysis, stuff like that, which comes from poor nutrition. Poor nutrition will probably influence you in a variety of different ways rather than just not having enough glycogen for training. So, I don't think it's as clear cut as all of that. But if there are stresses from life, from nutrition, from lack of sleep, ultimately that will increase your energy required at a given speed.
Yeah, and I think that is more often than not revealed more aggressively the more intensity required.
Mm-hmm.
I think
certainly.
That was the essence of my question, is a 1RM clean and jerk, you're going to know pretty quickly if it's not your day. And that might be as a result of, I don't know, a red-eye flight the night before. What's that beeping sound?
We definitely need to have a little look at the research around travel.
Circadian rhythm and stuff in context of all this would be fascinating to look at. I would love to deep dive on the impact of time zones, aviation, dehydration, like all this sort of stuff. It'd be fascinating.
Yeah, I have to admit it's not an area that I've looked into, but would happily look into it from like a hybrid perspective, because I think we are seeing a shift in. This is a whole podcast on its own, actually, which we can do.
Exciting.
But I think there's a shift in
Kelly,
culture.
that's number 2.
Where, before it was like, oh, you can't do strength and endurance together. And now everyone's like, well, obviously you can. Well, how can I push this a little bit more? Because it is quite performative, because it's a culture that's based on social media. So people are now doing things in different environments. They're going to be traveling around to be able to do things, like your Ironmans as well. Like,
I mean, everyone I've spoken to says the travel's going to be the worst thing. But even things like destination Ironman events, destination High Rocks events, there's things you are throwing in a variable that you aren't implementing in training that you then need to consider within the context of your performance. And I don't think, I don't think, right, I am going to this place to do this event. How am I controlling every controllable possible within the process of getting from A to B to optimize for my performance at said event? That is not as much of a consideration as it should be. And actually, I agree, Phil, would make for a fascinating podcast topic. So I look forward to seeing a photo of you sat in that reading chair behind you going, hello, Fergus. I am pondering and researching for this podcast topic discussion. And I look forward to having it. As
no screens allowed over there. That's a screen-free zone.
Is it? I like that.
Well,
it
comes
I had
from
one of those. And then
I was doing work there, and then I realised I'll have a break, and then I go on YouTube, and then I'm back to the laptop. And it's like, I've just been on a screen all day, and it's like, this is unhealthy. So agreed. I despise how dependent on screens I am. I've turned all notifications off on my phone recently and stuff like that. I feel vastly overstimulated amidst this training prep, and I yearn for a simpler life. Don't we all? Anyway, another fascinating conversation, Phil. Until next time, and I would like to remind everyone that there is a link in the description down below to sign up to one-to-one coaching with us, where we can help you manage your energy systems. There is also a link in the description down below for you to download a PDF where you can read all about the things that we think are relevant from a hybrid training point of view in terms of research, curated by Dr. Phil himself, the real Dr. Phil, none of this American talk show rubbish. And other than that, please do hit follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on, and share this episode or an episode previously with a friend, family member, or dog/cat if they have evolved enough to be able to operate a smartphone. Cheers. Are you okay for time, Phil?